The coach door opened, and the whole street stopped to watch the delicate bride step down, and what stepped down filled the doorway. She had to turn her shoulders to clear it. She came down the 2 iron steps, and they took her weight with a sound, and she stood up to her full height in the road, a head over most of the men gathered there, broad through the shoulder as a smith herself, hands that looked like they could shut around a hammer and mean it. The man who had sent for her stood across the street by his forge with a letter in his fist that promised something else entirely, and his face did a thing the whole town saw and would talk about for a year. Somebody laughed. The big woman set her trunk down in the dust, looked at the man with the letter, and said, "You'd be Gideon Roan. I expect that paper in your hand has got me described wrong. If you have ever been measured against a description somebody wrote of the woman they wanted instead of the woman you are, then stay with me, because by the end of this story the man holding that letter is going to thank God it lied. Comment the name of your city below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight." Now come back to the forge town of Hardin Creek, Montana, in the spring of 1884, where a mountain blacksmith sent away for a small and delicate wife, and a strong, towering woman climbed down off the coach instead, and shocked every soul who watched. Gideon Roan had not wanted a wife. He had wanted a description. That was the truth of it, and he was honest enough with himself to know it, even if he'd never have said it aloud. 3 years he'd run the forge alone on the edge of Hardin Creek, up where the timber road met the mountain, and 3 years it had been killing him by inches. Not the loneliness, he told himself, but the work. A one-man forge is a thing that eats a man. There is no second pair of hands to hold the long stock while you strike. No one to work the bellows steady while you draw a weld. No one to swing the sledge on the heavy pieces while you turn the iron under it. He had been doing the work of 2 men since the work of the second man had ended, and he had thought, in some confused and grieving corner of himself, that what he needed was a wife to make the rest of his life bearable enough that the forge stopped feeling like a sentence. So he had written to an agency in St. Louis, and because grief makes a man reach backward toward what he has lost rather than forward toward what he needs, he had asked for what his wife had been. Delicate, he'd written. Small, refined, a gentle woman for a hard place. Edith had been all of those things. Small enough to lift, fine-boned, a singer of hymns and a voice like water. The slope had taken her in the spring 3 years gone. Her and the colt she'd gone out to gentle. The both of them under the wet snow before he'd got down from the high pasture. He had asked the agency, without once admitting it to himself, to send him Edith back. What he got was Thora Lund. The stagecoach driver had tried to warn him, in the way drivers do, except this time the warning ran the other direction. Lund, the driver had said when Gideon met the coach. "The one you sent for. I'll tell you now, Smith, she ain't what your letter's expecting. Picked her up in Bozeman. Near broke the axle." He'd grinned. "Daughter of a Swede blacksmith," she told me. "Worked her daddy's forge in Minnesota till he died and the bank took it. Strong as 2 men and twice as quiet about it." "She read your notice and laughed," she said. "And then she answered it anyhow. You're in for a surprise, Roan, whether it's a good one's between you and the Almighty." And then the door had opened, and the surprise had stepped down and filled the road, and the town had laughed, and Thora Lund had not so much as glanced at them. She had felt that laughter her whole life. She knew its exact shape. She had been the tallest in the schoolhouse at 9, and the tallest in the church at 15, and the only girl in 3 counties who could shoe a horse her father wouldn't trust to the hired man. And the world had never once let her forget that she was built wrong for a woman. Too tall, too broad, too strong. Hands too hard, a body the world kept trying to apologize on her behalf. She had learned a long time ago that flinching only gave the laughers the satisfaction of a hit. So she stood in the road at her full towering height and let it roll off her like water off cooled iron, and she looked only at the man with the letter, because he was the only one whose opinion she had ridden 6 days of train and coach to discover. Gideon Roan looked at her and looked at the letter and could not find a single thing to say. The whole street watched him not find it. "That paper's got me wrong," Thora said again, evenly. "No heat in it, just fact. I know it does, because I read the notice it came from. You asked for delicate. I'm the furthest thing from it that ever drew breath." She picked her trunk back up off the ground, one-handed, the way another woman might lift a hat box, and the street went quiet at that. "But I'll tell you what I am, since you've gone speechless. I'm a blacksmith's daughter and a blacksmith myself, trained at a forge from the time I could hold the tongs. You sent away for a wife to make your life bearable. I expect what you actually need is a striker who won't quit at noon. So you can put me back on that coach and feel cheated. Or you can walk me up to your forge and find out what you really sent for. Your choice, Mr. Roan. But decide it standing up, because I've been sitting 6 days." It was, the town agreed later, the most anyone had ever heard a woman say to Gideon Roan, and the most they'd ever seen him fail to answer. He walked her up to the forge. He didn't know what else to do, and somewhere under the panic a part of him was curious, and curiosity was the first thing besides grief he'd felt in 3 years. The forge told her everything, the way these places do. It was a good shop gone hard, solid stone hearth, a fine old anvil, decent tools, all of it worn down by a man doing 2 men's work alone for 3 years. The bellows leaked at a seam and made his fire sulk. The slack tub was filthy. There was a backlog of work hung on the wall in tags, wheel rims promised, a plowshare, a church hinge a month overdue, more than one man could ever clear, the visible arithmetic of a shop slowly drowning. And there was a second leather apron on a peg by the door, cracked and stiff, with 3 years of not being worn, that she understood without being told had belonged to whoever used to swing the sledge. She did not ask about the apron. She took down the leaking bellows, found the split in the seam, and had it stitched and pitched and breathing right inside the hour she had not been invited to. She simply saw the fire sulking and could not stand to watch it. Gideon Roan watched a towering woman he had not wanted fix the thing that had been strangling his fire for a year, and he opened his mouth, and nothing came out, which was becoming a habit. But that night, after she'd gone up to the loft he'd cleared for her, there was a stack of firewood by the kitchen door taller than the morning would need, and the slack tub had been emptied and scrubbed and refilled clean, which was his half of a conversation neither of them was saying out loud. The proving came at the anvil, the way it had to. The third morning a teamster brought in a wagon with a cracked iron tire on a back wheel, needed by noon, the kind of job that is simple and impossible alone. You cannot heat the tire, set it, and shrink it true with only 2 hands and 1 back. Gideon had been turning such jobs away for 3 years and losing the trade for it. Thora put on the cracked apron off the peg without asking, and he watched her do it and said nothing. And the not saying was its own permission, and she worked the bellows steady while he drew the heat, and when it came time to set the tire she swung the sledge, true, and measured, every blow landing exactly where his tongs turned the iron to meet it, the 2 of them falling into the rhythm of it, without a word, the way 2 smiths do who have the trade in their hands and need no talk to share it. The tire went on true. It was done by 10. The teamster paid and spread the word, and by afternoon 2 more jobs had come up the road that Gideon Roan had not been able to take in 3 years. She worked beside him after that. Not for him. Beside him. She had not been hired, and she had not been wed. She had come on a false description and stayed on a true skill. And somewhere in the ring of hammer on hammer, it stopped being a wrong delivery and became the only arrangement that had ever made the forge make sense. He had sent for a wife to make his life bearable. He had gotten a partner who made his life work. And the difference between those two things was teaching him something he did not yet have words for. But the food scene came too, because even a smith has to eat, and because she was more than the forge. She found him one night gnawing cold biscuit standing up by the banked fire. The way a man eats who has forgotten food is for anything but fuel. And she asked him when he'd last had a hot meal sat down, and he could not rightly remember. So she fed the forge's heat into the kitchen stove and she cooked. A blacksmith's daughter cooks like she works, plain and hot and enough. And the smell of it filled the shop and the house, and she set a real plate in front of him and said, "Sit, the iron'll keep. It's the one thing in this life that always keeps." He sat. He ate slowly, the way a starved man eats when he's ashamed of the hunger, and when he was done he stayed at the table longer than the meal required. And that was its own kind of speaking too. Gideon began to surface, the way the mountain comes back in spring. A word, then two. Then, one evening, watching her bank the fire for the night the proper way, the way only someone forge-raised knows, he said the thing he'd been carrying. "My brother used to bank it like that," he said. "Eli, he swung the sledge here 12 years. His hands had gone still. It was him on the slope with my wife that spring. They'd both gone out after the colt. The snow took the two of them at once." He stopped. The words came flat and terrible and low. "I asked the agency for a delicate wife because I was trying to get her back. I know how it sounds, but it wasn't only her I lost on that mountain. I lost the man who held the other end of every job in this shop, and I've been doing the work of 3 people and grieving 2 of them, and I didn't even know which loss I was writing that letter about." He shook his head slowly. "I sent for a small woman to replace my wife. What I needed was a striker to replace my brother. I couldn't tell my own grief apart well enough to ask for the right thing. Thora Lund did not tell him it was not his fault, because he knew that, and it had never helped. She finished banking the fire so it would hold the night, and she said, 'Then it's a mercy the description lied, isn't it? You asked for the wrong thing, and the right thing came anyway.' She hung the tongs on their hook. 'I'm not your wife, and I'm not your brother. But I can hold the other end of any job in this shop, and I've buried a father's forge myself, so I know what it is to lose the work and the man in the same grave. You don't have to tell those 2 losses apart anymore, Gideon. You can just let somebody pick up the sledge.' Something in the shop changed, and did not change back. The trouble came down the road with the spring trade, the way it does. There was a man named Asa Thorne who ran the freight company that hauled for half the county, and Thorne had wanted Gideon Roan's forge for 2 years. Its location at the timber road, its water, its custom, and had been waiting for the one-man shop to drown. Now it wasn't drowning. Now it was thriving, and the reason was a woman, and Asa Thorne knew exactly how to turn a town against a woman. He let it be known, in the saloon and the store and the church porch, that the smith was keeping an unwed woman up at his shop, sharing his roof, wearing a dead man's apron, doing a man's filthy labor like no decent female would, and that a man who'd send for one bride and live in sin with whatever got off the coach was not the sort the county should be giving its contracts to. He had the county freight contract in his pocket to dangle. It would go to a respectable shop, he said, not a scandal. And he had enough of the church ladies whispering that he could make the threat stick. Gideon Roan stood in his own shop and listened to Thorne lay it out. And Thora saw his fist close around a hammer haft. and saw 3 years of grief turn hot and dangerous behind his eyes, and watched him set the hammer down, because a smith who brains a freight man in front of witnesses hangs and helps no one. "You've got till the church social Saturday to make it right," Thorne said pleasantly. "Send her back, take the contract, be respectable. Or keep your scandal and lose your trade. Your choice, Roan." And he went back down the road. That night Gideon did not eat. He stood by the cold forge, and Thora let him be until she could not, and she came and stood across the anvil from him, where a striker stands. "I'll go," she said. "Saturday morning, before the social. Let Thorne have his respectable, and you keep your contract and your shop. I came on a false paper, Gideon. Nobody'd say you owed me a thing." Her voice was steady, because she'd practiced steadiness her whole life. "I can find a forge somewhere that doesn't care what a smith looks like, if such a place exists. I won't be the thing that ruins you." And Gideon Roan looked at her across the anvil, where for 3 weeks they had built every true thing the shop had made, and he found the words at last. "You'll not go anywhere," he said. "I held a letter the day you came down off that coach, a letter I wrote asking for a small, delicate woman, and I stood in that road and couldn't speak, because the truth hit me all at once, and I wasn't ready for it." His voice shook and held. "The truth was that the letter was wrong, and you were right. And not just for the forge. 3 weeks you've swung that sledge and the shop breathes again, and so do I. I sleep. I eat sitting down. I said my brother's name out loud for the first time since the slide, to you across this anvil. He came around it to stand in front of her, and even then he had to look up to do it, and he did not seem to mind. I sent away for a wife to replace what I'd buried. I'll not insult you by calling you a replacement for anybody, because you're not. You're the only thing that ever fit this shop and this life and grief and all. I'm asking you to stay, and I'm asking you to marry me, and I'm asking in that order on purpose, because the staying matters more than the wedding, and I want you to know I know the difference." He almost smiled. "Thorne wants respectable. Let's give the whole county respectable, Saturday, in front of all of them. Married at the social. And let him choke on it." Thora Lund, who had been laughed down off a coach 3 weeks before and had not let them see it land, let this land all the way, and said yes. Saturday came, and all of Hardin Creek turned out at the church social, because a freight man and a blacksmith squared off over a towering woman is precisely the story a town will leave its supper for. Asa Thorne came in his good coat, with the county contract folded in it, expecting to watch a scandal sent packing. What he watched instead was Gideon Roan stand up in front of the whole congregation with Thora Lund beside him, and the preacher already waiting, and the bands already spoken. And then Gideon Roan, who had not said 10 words in public in 3 years, said the ones that mattered. He did not make a speech. Men like him don't. He looked out at the town that had laughed her down off the coach, and he said, 3 weeks back you all watched a woman get off a coach, and you laughed, because she wasn't what my letter asked for. A breath. I'm here to tell you my letter was a fool's letter, wrote by a man too deep in grief to know what he needed. I asked for delicate. What I needed was the best striker in this territory, and God or the agency sent her by mistake, and I mean to keep the mistake. He looked at Thorne. This woman set a tire true her 3rd morning here that I'd been turning trade away on for 3 years. She fixed the bellows that's been strangling my fire. She does the work of the brother I buried, and she does it better. And there's not a man in this room who'd say a word about her size if she shot his horse. You'd just be grateful it stood true. He took Thora's hand. She's going to be my wife inside the hour, in front of all, and she's going to be my partner at that forge for as long as we both can swing a hammer. Anybody who wants respectable can witness a wedding. Anybody who wants a scandal can leave now. He turned to the preacher. Go on. It was more than anyone in Hardin Creek had heard Gideon Roan say in 3 years, and it was enough. They were married on the spot, in front of the whole county, and the county, which had come to watch a woman shamed, found itself witnessing a wedding instead, and not one soul left. Asa Thorne stood holding his folded contract, with no scandal left to hang it on. A respectable married smith with the busiest forge on the Timber Road is a poor thing to deny a county contract to, and the town knew it, and Thorne knew the town knew it, and he gave the contract over within the month, rather than be the man who'd tried to break a marriage to steal a forge. He took his freight business down valley not long after. Nobody in Hardin Creek was sorry to see the road clear. They walked back up to the forge that evening, married, with the spring light long on the mountain, and Gideon said, "Worst letter I ever wrote." Asked for the wrong woman entirely. He shook his head. Best mistake the St. Louis agency ever made. I ought to write and thank them for not reading it close. Thora laughed, the big sound of it rolling down the road, and Gideon Roan, who folks would have sworn had forgotten how, laughed with her. The two of them shoulder to shoulder, near enough the same height that they could be, which neither of them had ever had with anyone before, and both of them noticed, and neither said. 20 years later, the sign over the shop read Roan and Roan, Smiths, and the second name belonged to their daughter, who had her mother's height and her mother's hands, and could set a tire true at 14. The forge on the Timber Road was the busiest in 3 counties. The cracked apron Thora had taken off the peg her first morning had long since been mended and worn soft and handed down. Eli's name was spoken in that shop without grief now. The way you speak of a good man you wish had stayed for the rest of it. The fire never sulked again. And on cold mornings the heat of the forge warmed the kitchen through the wall, and there were always children to warm their hands at it, and a tall woman at the anvil who had never once, after that first morning in the road, been laughed at in Hardin Creek again. Thora Lund Roan never once apologized for the space she took up in this world, nor for the height of her, nor for the strength in her 2 hands that the world had spent her whole life trying to make her ashamed of. She had been sent for as a delicate woman, ordered like a small and ornamental thing, and she had climbed down off that coach exactly as large and as strong as God had made her, and refused to shrink an inch of it. She had not been what the letter asked for. She had been, it turned out, the only thing that letter ever truly needed. The striker for the empty side of the anvil, the partner for the half-drowned shop, the one person tall enough to stand beside that silent man and look him level in the eye. She had been enough from the moment she filled that coach door. It only took a frightened town and a grieving man with the wrong letter in his fist a little while to be shocked into seeing it.